When you think of Central Illinois and the geography that we know Central Illinois to be, that he was pretty much the preeminent painter, period.
If there was a portrait commissioned, then usually Robert Root was the person that was called.
He had friends literally all over the world, but he kept coming back to this little county seat in the middle of Illinois. He kept coming home.
On a sunny summer Saturday, a group of painters take their places in Shelbyville's Forest Park. They're retired art teachers who enjoy working in plain air.
You have to work quickly, which I like to do anyway. Fresh air, and the colors are truer than taking a photograph to work from.
As these artists capture those natural colors, they're joining a history of painting nature in Shelby County. A history that stretches back to the community's best-known artist, Robert Marshall Root.
He's just a name that people remember in history for their art. A lot of people collect his buildings or just really anything of his anymore.
We are about to enter the Robert Root Room at the Shelby County Historical and Genealogical Society. So come right on in, welcome.
Ed Bodecker has collected and studied Root's paintings for years.
His parents were John and Eunice Cook Root. John Root, it's my understanding that he was an engineer on the railroad. And of course his wife, Eunice Cook Root, was a housewife.
Root was born in Shelbyville in 1863. When Root was a young boy, his family moved to a home outside town. Root later remembered those years in the country, walking to watch the work of a nearby mill, and once seeing smoke from the Great Chicago Fire drift overhead. He also described an early attempt at art, trying to draw a tree full of jaybirds. He called that the most satisfying thing he'd ever done. Root later remembered, the only literature we had to read in those days was the Saturday Night Magazine and the New York Ledger. There were all sorts of tales that told about the sunlight gently tipping her hair and her alabaster neck floating gently into the room. I read those stories and got ideas about life. When Root was 11, his family moved back to town. At age 12, Root began his career in art.
Young Robert knew that he had an aptitude for drawing at a very early age. He saw a man here in town drawing some houses of some of the more affluent citizens here, and he watched this fellow draw for a while, and then he realized, well, I can do that, and he did. He took right off with it, and he made some drawings of houses and was able to sell them and make a little extra money.
In 1879, Root's father died, and Robert quit school. He took on work retouching photographs, but continued drawing on his own. When the Chicago cartoonist Horace Taylor visited Shelbyville, he saw Root's drawings and urged him to study in New York.
And so he managed to get a scholarship to the Cooper Union, which is a very prestigious educational entity in New York City. He then, for some inexplicable reason, was only there for a brief period of time.
I really think he was a bit disillusioned there because they told him that it would be 2 to 3 years before he could do what he already knew he could do. And he came home after a very short period of time.
But the detail here this time is in the middle.
Jeff Lilly collects and studies Root's work too. He says Root's return was short-lived.
He received another scholarship to attend Washington University in St. Louis. And so he actually did complete his studies there, received a bachelor's degree in art, and was awarded the top art student in his senior year. He starts a very interesting life. He was born in 1863, so you fast forward up into the late 1800s. What you have going on there's a lot of new art being thought about, especially in Europe. So the Paris salons are happening. There's a lot of conversation that goes on in the salons. I think he was enamored with it. So he applied and was accepted to the Académie Julienne in Paris. And so he received some sponsorships from local families, patronages, and he went to Europe. His time in Paris, we know that he studied, we know he exhibited. We don't know exactly what he exhibited, but we know that he worked under a lot of very famous artists.
Well, the trajectory is actually a very classical approach from the standpoint of an artist trying to make their way into the profession. So he obviously had skill, was allowed to go to study in Europe with some major artists at the time, like Bergerot, and the people that were training with him were also well-respected artists, and so he was in the mix.
The one in the middle was one that he did in Paris about 1890, and it's Notre Dame at midnight.
Root later remembered Paris as bright and gay and beautiful, but after 2 years, he returned to Shelbyville.
Just shortly before he left France, he had an opportunity to work for a man by the name of Tiffany in New York, designing stained glass windows. And he did just that for a very short period of time, but he got sick while he was out there. And he also, designing stained glass windows was not what he wanted to do with his life. So when he got sick, he came home. Eventually opened an art studio here in Shelbyville.
The obligation was, because he had assistants going to study in Europe, was that he was going to come back and work in Shelbyville. And by choice also, he wanted to be in Shelbyville. He had plenty of opportunities, thinking in terms of, going off to other cities and things like that, but he was committed to Shelbyville, and he stayed there for pretty much his whole career.
Back in Illinois, Root's work became indispensable.
So since he was a native son there, people would come and ask him, hey, would you paint a picture of my building? And he would, because he needed money to live. And so, I think his wide-ranging skills are shown in the breadth of his work.
He was very versatile, and that also fed into the idea that sometimes he was doing things that were obviously meant to pay the rent. So, a portrait of somebody's dog, an advertisement or a postcard for some farm implement or something like that. So he did some commercial work. He obviously did a lot of commission work for the whole spectrum of types of sitters, not just wealthy, sitters, but just everyday family kinds of sittings. During that early part of the 20th century, if there was a portrait commission to be solicited, then usually Robert Root was the person that was called, at least initially, whether he could have executed it based on time or whatever.
A.E. Staley came to him and asked, will you paint my portrait? Livingston Lord, the first president of EIU, came to him and said, will you paint my portrait? So, I think especially a testament to his portraiture, sits there and says that he was important because these people came to him.
Other pieces were allegorical, even whimsical.
This is a large sundial on the ground, and you can see here's 12, there's 10.
He was very formal, but also had this unbelievable imagination, as evidenced in some of those mythological and almost fantastical paintings of the nymphs and the other things that you see in some of his more allegorical work.
And yet, Root's deepest passion drew him outdoors.
Root was a tonalist, And tonalistic painting is a focus on the natural. So you don't see a lot of human design elements in his paintings. It's not uncommon to see some, and he's done some other things, but I think he enjoyed painting what he wanted to paint at that moment in time. You see detail here, and then it becomes just a little more ethereal. And so you can see that's tonalism.
He evolved into spending a lot of time just capturing the landscape in different seasons, in a variety of locations, and some of the settings and those sites were repeated multiple times. So it was, you know, going out over several years. An artist doesn't do that unless they're enjoying themselves. Very Midwestern landscapes, yeah. And different seasons. The watercolors are generally done on illustration board, and they're fairly small. And that's another indication that when an artist does that kind of work, he's on site. And he also used a dry brush technique for a lot of it, which meant that he was just using very little water and color water onto the board itself. There is evidence that some of the watercolor studies that are basically like 9 by 14 or 10 by 16 or something like that were possibly used as studies for larger oil paintings that he then would do back in the studio.
Root traveled occasionally, painting at least once in Wisconsin and California. In his 40s, Root began working with painters in Indiana.
It's a Brown County, Indiana scene, and you can see the cabin with the lights in the windows, the smoke coming out of the chimney, and the reflection of the evening twilight on the water puddle in the road.
There's a group of very famous artists of which Root was a part of that were called the Brown County School, and so based just south of Indianapolis. And so Root was one of the charter members of the Brown County Artists Association. There were only 2 Illinoisans, Root and Paul Turner Sargent, who taught at Eastern Illinois University for a lot of years as well.
His friend Paul Sargent, who lived southeast of Charleston, and Mr. Root were the only 2 Illinois artists that had been invited to join the Hoosier group. Now this was back in the 20s when such Indiana notables as T.C. Steele and L.O. Griffith and Adolph Schulz, Ada Schulz, they were active over there.
There's a famous photograph by the great Brown County photographer Frank Hohenberger, and there's a picture of all the original group of artists. There's about 20 of them in the picture. There's some ladies there as well, and there's Root on the end in a very formal pose with a bowler hat and a you know, perfectly pressed suit. And I think, you know, as I think back to what Root would have been like, that perfectly encapsulates who I believe he was. He was very formal, but also had this unbelievable imagination.
You can see that imagination in this painting of fellow artist Adolph Schulz, complete with a little artistic joke in the painter's pocket. But despite his connections, Root remained a Shelbyville artist.
He felt that that was where he was drawn to be, with somebody who has that amazing set of opportunities and that clearly high level of talent. He could have been in New York. He could have remained in Paris or gone to Munich or London or the other centers of art and culture, which he clearly loved, but he kept coming home.
Through the years, Root set out to capture the history of Central Illinois on canvas.
The one that's most well known in Shelbyville is the Lincoln-Thornton debate. And so everyone in and around there knows who Anthony Thornton was. He was a friend of Root's. He was a congressman. He was a judge. He was a state Supreme Court justice. He's a very ubiquitous name around the area as well, even to this date. His mansion is the American Legion in Shelbyville. And so everyone knows Thornton. They had an actual debate well before the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It was more like a series of speeches given on both parts, but it was and so to this day it's reenacted in Shelbyville. So he painted. There's no accounts of the contemporary accounts are only written, so Root did this from his mind's eye about what it looked like. Every person that he knew to be there, he painted in the painting.
He took a number of years to do that. He interviewed some of the original people that had been actually at the debate. Judge Moulton, Mr. Root asked him about this debate in 1856, and Judge Moulton supposedly said, that was no debate. Lincoln made a speech. So that's what Moulton thought of Mr. Lincoln's talk. And they got the layout of the courtroom, and the brick floor, and the guardrail, and the windows, and then the people who were there, actually there.
But the most seen of Root's paintings shows another debate, the debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in Charleston.
There was a contest to make portraits of the debates. Mr. Root went over to Charleston and got the layout of the land there at the fairgrounds, and he also interviewed a Mrs. Harriet Chapman, who had actually been at the debate, and this was in 1858. She was a young girl at the time. And all those men on that platform are identifiable. That was finished in July 4th, 1917. And it was painted to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Illinois becoming a state. Now, it's my understanding that when it was first transported to Springfield, it hung out at the fairgrounds. Well, then at some point was moved to the Capitol building, and then during Governor Edgar's term in office was moved where it is now, up in the ceremonial office.
Governor Jim Edgar said he was so fond of the painting, he had it included in his official portrait. Back in Shelbyville, Root left a clear mark on the landscape. He designed the city's Soldiers and Sailors Memorial, painted murals like this one at the Shelbyville Methodist Church, and drafted the stage for the Shelbyville Chautauqua.
I think he was the go-to person. He was, likely by far in a way the most creative person in the city. And so I think when somebody wanted to do something, they went with him, either to help design things. He obviously had a working knowledge of architecture as well as sculpture beyond, and I'm sure he, at least on the sculpture and architecture side, likely had to take some classes in that in his original schooling at WashU. Root never married. He had brothers and sisters, but beyond that, he lived the life of a bachelor. And so he was very close with many people in the city, lived in rooming houses, so he lived somewhat like an itinerant person, but he never went anywhere.
Though Root seldom traveled beyond the Midwest, one of his final works did.
James Schoaf of Shelbyville exhibited this poster, The Spirit of Flight, designed by the late Robert Root, Shelbyville artist. The airmail poster was painted in 1936. It was a contest by the U.S. Postal Service, and that's my understanding that it was to be used as a pattern for an airmail stamp. It won the contest, and it traveled to various postmasters conventions, went practically all over the country.
Robert Marshall Root died August 21st, 1937. He was buried at Shelbyville's Glenwood Cemetery.
It was a big deal. It was a large affair. He was a favorite son of, we've had congressmen, we've had Supreme Court justices, we've had a lot of generals, who called that area home. But his passing left a mark on there so much that the governor came to his funeral and gave remarks. And he said that he is deserving of something more than praise.
70 years later, Millikan University art chair Ed Walker assembled an exhibit and a catalog of Root's work called Something More Than Praise.
During the summer prior to the exhibition, we literally put out a call for people in Shelbyville and the surrounding areas to bring the work to the church. And we photographed it, documented it right there, and they were able to take it away, or they were able to arrange to leave it with us so that we could then include it in the exhibition.
Many of those pieces were passed down through families and kept in private homes. Karen Perez found hers at auction.
Yes, the history of Robert Root is very well known in Shelbyville, and I've always wanted a painting, but they go so high and they're hard to find.
It's fascinating to me to look at the commitment that the people that still own his pieces have to his work, and they're very proud. You know, they're proud owners of Robert Root's work. It means something very special to them to have and to own those pieces.
Along with his work, Root has left another legacy.
So like maybe something like right here.
Shelbyville art teacher Caleb Mathis shares that legacy with his students, especially working outdoors, as Root often did.
There's just something about, connecting with nature, and I think relating to Root, like he was, I don't know, he was connecting with nature, and he was kind of expressing that through his paintings, and I think that's what makes it so popular, is like people can really relate to that because it's something they see or whatever, and I want to show that to the kids, that it's not just a boring landscape, it's kind of like your feelings about the landscape. It doesn't matter where you're from, you can make a career out of art. And that's like, he's a person that's, he's a testament to that.
For those fascinated by Robert Root, his legacy teaches another lesson too.
He was a Shelbyville boy, could have done something with his life, but chose to stay here.
You can't really talk about Robert Root without actually talking about where he came from and the idea that he stayed there. He had some friends, and they did work together and travel together sometimes. But essentially, again, I think that he just quietly went about doing the work that he did.
He clearly had a love of his community and the people in it, and I think that it's a lesson for us now, especially in the Midwest, where we struggle to attract, or more importantly retain, talent. He stands as kind of a clarion call to say, hey, you can make it, and you can go away, and you can always go back home.